It was the winter of 1986, and Stevie Ray Vaughan was sitting alone in a dimly lit room at the back of a rehabilitation center in Atlanta, Georgia, his hands trembling so badly that he could not even hold a guitar pick between his fingers. The man who had made 15,000 people weep with a single bend of a string on his battered Fender Stratocaster. The man who had resurrected the Texas blues and made it roar louder than anyone since the days of Albert King and Muddy Waters, was now staring at the cold tile floor wondering if he would ever touch a fretboard again. He had checked himself in after collapsing backstage in Germany, his body finally surrendering to years of cocaine, whiskey, and a lifestyle that had nearly killed him twice in the span of 6 months. The doctors told him he was lucky to be alive, but Stevie did not feel lucky. He felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything that made him who he was and left behind nothing but shaking hands and an unbearable silence where music used to live. He had not played a single note in 23 days, the longest stretch since he first picked up a guitar at the age of 7 in the small town of Oak Cliff, Dallas. And on that particular evening, when the weight of silence had become almost too much to bear, an unlikely visitor walked through the door, a man nobody in that facility expected to see, a man whose reputation was built on Jack Daniels, speed, and the loudest bass guitar in the history of rock and roll. Lemmy Kilmister had not come to preach, he had not come to offer sympathy, and he certainly had not come to tell Stevie Ray Vaughan that everything was going to be all right. Instead, he said 6 words that would reshape the trajectory of one of the greatest comebacks in music history. 6 words that Stevie would carry with him for the rest of his life. 6 words that he would whisper to himself before every single show from that night until the very last time he ever stepped on a stage. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss another story like this one. To understand why those 6 words mattered so much, and to understand why Lemmy Kilmister of all people was the one who delivered them, you have to go back to the beginning, back to the roads that brought these 2 wildly different men to the same crossroads at the same time. Stevie Ray Vaughan grew up in Oak Cliff, a rough neighborhood on the south side of Dallas, Texas, where the blues was not something you studied in a textbook, but something you absorbed through the walls of juke joints and the crackle of late-night radio stations that played Albert King, Howlin' Wolf, and B.B. King, until the signal faded into static. His older brother Jimmy was already playing guitar around Dallas by the time Stevie was 8 years old, and the younger Vaughan would sneak into clubs underage, just to watch his brother's fingers dance across the fretboard. By the time he was 12, Stevie could play things that grown men who had been practicing for decades could not figure out, and by 17, he had dropped out of high school and moved to Austin, where the live music scene was raw, hungry, and absolutely perfect for a kid who played the blues like his soul was on fire. Across the Atlantic Ocean, in the gray industrial town of Stoke-on-Trent, England, a young Ian Fraser Kilmister, who the world would come to know simply as Lemmy, was on a completely different path that would somehow, decades later, intersect with the Texas blues prodigy in ways that neither of them could have predicted. Lemmy had discovered rock and roll through the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, but it was the raw, unpolished energy of Little Richard and Chuck Berry that really set his blood on fire. By the late 1960s, Lemmy had found his way into the orbit of Jimi Hendrix, serving as his roadie, and by most accounts, his supplier of certain substances that were as common backstage as guitar strings in those days. And here is where the invisible thread between Lemmy and Stevie Ray Vaughan first begins to weave itself together, because Jimi Hendrix was not just a musical hero to Stevie, he was the reason Stevie picked up a guitar in the first place. The same man who gave Lemmy his first real taste of the rock and roll life was the very same man whose poster hung on the wall of a small bedroom in Oak Cliff, Texas, where a 7-year-old boy was teaching himself to play by ear. Through the 1970s and into the early 80s, both men carved their names into the history of music through very different but equally relentless paths. Lemmy, After being kicked out of the space rock band Hawkwind following a drug arrest at the Canadian border in 1975, had channeled his fury into creating Motorhead, a band so loud and so fast that it essentially invented a new genre of music. The 1980 album Ace of Spades had cemented Lemmy as one of the most iconic figures in heavy metal, a man who drank a bottle of Jack Daniels every single day, consumed enough amphetamines to kill a horse, and still managed to get on stage every night and deliver a performance that left audiences shaking. Stevie, meanwhile, had taken the Austin music scene by storm with his band Double Trouble, and his 1983 debut album Texas Flood had announced his arrival to the world like a thunderclap on a clear day. David Bowie heard him play at Montreux and asked him to play on Let's Dance. The legendary producer John Hammond, who discovered Bob Dylan, signed Stevie to Epic Records after a single set. By 1985, Stevie Ray Vaughan was being called the greatest blues guitarist of his generation, and some critics were already comparing him to Hendrix himself, a comparison that would have seemed absurd just 3 years earlier for a kid from Oak Cliff who used to play for tips in Austin dive bars. But fame has a way of feeding the very demons it pretends to celebrate. And for Stevie, the demons were cocaine and Crown Royal whiskey. What most people did not know was that Stevie had been using cocaine since his teens, but the habit of a struggling musician became the uncontrollable addiction of a rock star with unlimited access and money. By 1986, he was consuming nearly 7 grams of cocaine per day, washing it down with enough whiskey to put most men in a coma, and the toll was becoming impossible to hide. His hands shook before shows, his vision blurred during solos that he used to play with his eyes closed, and the fire that had always burned inside his playing was being slowly suffocated by the white powder that he could no longer go more than a few hours without. The collapse in Germany was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. It was an inevitability, and when they carried him off that stage in Ludwigshafen, many people in the music industry quietly assumed that Stevie Ray Vaughan's story was over. The rehabilitation center in Atlanta was supposed to be a fresh start, but for Stevie, it felt more like a funeral. The first week was pure physical agony, his body purging itself of years of accumulated poison in ways that were violent and humiliating, cold sweats that soaked through his sheets at 3 a.m, nausea that came in waves so powerful he could not stand, and a bone-deep ache that made him feel like his skeleton was trying to crawl out of his skin. But the physical withdrawal, as brutal as it was nothing compared to the psychological torment that followed once his body began to stabilize. Stevie had been playing guitar since he was 7 years old, and for nearly 30 years, music had been the only thing that made sense in his world, the only language he truly spoke, the only place where the noise inside his head quieted down long enough for him to breathe. Now, sitting in that sterile room with its white walls and fluorescent lights, he could not play. His hands would not cooperate, his fingers felt thick and clumsy and foreign, like they belonged to someone else, and every time he tried to form a chord, the trembling got worse. By the end of the second week, a dark thought had begun to take root in his mind, a thought that grew a little stronger with each passing day of silence. Maybe the music was never really his to begin with. Maybe the cocaine had been the source of whatever magic people thought they heard when he played, and without it, he was just another guitar player from Texas with fast fingers and nothing to say. He started telling the counselors that he was thinking about quitting music altogether, maybe going back to Dallas and finding some kind of normal job, something that did not require him to stand in front of thousands of people and pretend that he still had something left to give. The counselors tried their best, but how do you convince a man whose entire identity is wrapped up in 6 strings and a wooden body that he still has a reason to pick up that instrument when his own hands are telling him otherwise? And it was right there, in that exact moment of despair, when the least likely person in the entire world of rock and roll walked through the door and changed everything. Nobody has ever fully explained what brought Lemmy to that rehabilitation center. Some accounts suggest a mutual friend called and told him Stevie was in bad shape. Others say Lemmy, on a motorhead tour in the southeastern United States, heard through the grapevine and decided to stop by. What is certain is that Lemmy was not the kind of man who visited rehab centers. He consumed enough amphetamines and Jack Daniels daily to make doctors question basic biology, had never been to rehab himself, and famously declared he would rather die on his feet than live on his knees. So when the staff saw a tall, gaunt figure in a leather vest covered in bullet belt accessories walking down their clinical hallway, they did not know what to make of it. Lemmy asked where Stevie was, and that low, gravelly voice convinced them to just point him in the right direction. When Lemmy pushed open the door to Stevie's room, the scene he found was not what he expected. The greatest blues guitarist of his generation was sitting on the edge of a single bed, staring at a guitar case that was leaning against the wall across the room. The case was closed. It had been closed for 23 days. Stevie looked up, and for a moment, neither man said anything. They had met before, briefly, at festivals and backstage gatherings where the worlds of metal and blues occasionally collided, but they had never spent any real time together, never had a conversation that went deeper than a handshake and a mutual nod of respect. Lemmy looked at the closed guitar case, then looked at Stevie, and then he did something that surprised everyone who later heard about this encounter. He sat down on the floor, right there on the cold tile, crossed his legs, and just sat there in silence for what witnesses say was nearly 10 minutes. No words, no advice, no motivational speeches. Just two men sitting in a room with a closed guitar case between them. What happened next has been told and retold in slightly different versions over the years, but the core of the story has remained consistent across every account. After those long minutes of silence, Lemmy finally spoke, and what he said was not a grand philosophical statement or a carefully crafted piece of wisdom. It was simple, direct, and delivered in that unmistakable British growl that had been shouting over Marshall amplifiers for more than a decade. He looked at Stevie and he said, "Your hands remember what you forgot." That was it. 6 words. No elaboration, no follow-up, no motivational poster language about believing in yourself or fighting through the darkness. Lemmy said those 6 words, and then he just sat there, looking at Stevie with the same steady gaze that he used to stare down rowdy audiences from the stage. And something about those words, something about the absolute simplicity and the unexpected tenderness of that sentence coming from the mouth of the hardest man in rock and roll, broke through the wall that Stevie had been building around himself for 23 days. Your hands remember what you forgot. It was not about willpower or courage or fighting addiction. It was about the fact that Stevie's relationship with music was older and deeper than his relationship with cocaine, older than his fame, older than everything that had gone wrong. His hands had been playing since he was 7, long before the cocaine, the whiskey, the lights, and the crowds. The music was not something the drugs had given him. It was something the drugs had been slowly stealing, and his hands were simply waiting for him to come back. Stevie stared at Lemmy for a long time, and then, without saying anything, he walked across the room, opened the guitar case, and picked up his Stratocaster for the first time in 23 days. His hands were still shaking, his fingers were still clumsy, and the first chord he played was rough and imperfect and nothing like the sound that had made him famous. But he played it, and then he played another, and then another. And somewhere around the 5th or 6th chord, something shifted. Something deep in his muscle memory woke up and recognized what it was supposed to do, and his fingers began to move with a fraction of the fluency that had once made critics compare him to Jimi Hendrix. Lemmy sat on that floor the entire time, listening, not saying a word, just letting the music fill the space that silence had occupied for far too long. The months that followed were not easy, and 6 words did not magically cure Stevie of his addiction. His journey back was filled with setbacks, doubt, and days when the craving was so powerful he had to physically leave situations where cocaine would be available. But something fundamental had changed. Stevie had been given permission to trust his body again, to believe the music lived in his hands and not in the substances, and that permission came from the most unlikely source, a man who was himself consuming enough drugs and alcohol to qualify as a biohazard. The irony was not lost on Stevie, and in the years that followed, he would often laugh about it in interviews, though he was always careful to express deep gratitude alongside the humor. By the spring of 1987, Stevie was clean and sober, and by the summer, he was back on the road with Double Trouble, playing with a clarity and emotional depth that many critics said surpassed even his best work from the pre-rehab years. The 1989 album In Step, his first record made completely sober, won a Grammy Award and was widely regarded as the finest work of his career. And those who listened closely could hear something different in his playing, a warmth and a vulnerability that had always been there, but had been buried under layers of chemical haze. The fire was back, but it was a different kind of fire now, not the desperate, reckless blaze of a man running from his own demons, but the steady, controlled burn of a man who had looked into the darkness, seen what was waiting for him there, and chosen to walk back toward the light. What surprised the music industry was not just that Stevie recovered, but that his friendship with Lemmy deepened. On paper, they had nothing in common. Lemmy was heavy metal incarnate, Rickenbacker bass at volumes that could loosen fillings. Stevie was the blues, all soul and feel, a man who could make a single note reach into your chest and squeeze your heart. But beneath those differences, they shared a deep love for the roots of rock and roll, for Chuck Berry and Muddy Waters and all the artists who laid the foundation both metal and blues were built on. Whenever touring brought them to the same city, they found each other after shows at some bar past last call, talking about music for hours, not business or fame, but actual sounds, the way a guitar tone could make you feel 17 again. Lemmy never once told Stevie to stay sober, never lectured him about relapse. That was not his style, and it would have been hypocritical from a man still drinking a bottle of Jack Daniels every day. Instead, Lemmy simply showed up, again and again, in that quiet, reliable way that true friends do when presence is enough. There was another layer to their bond that most people never understood. Jimi Hendrix connected Lemmy and Stevie in ways that went beyond mutual respect. Lemmy had known Hendrix personally, lived in the same house with him in London, watched him play from just a few feet away. Stevie had never met Hendrix, but his entire identity was shaped by a man who died when Stevie was 15. For Stevie, talking to Lemmy about Hendrix was like a window into a world he could only imagine. He told Stevie about the way Hendrix would sit in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, playing acoustic guitar so quietly you could barely hear it, working out melodies that would later become some of the most iconic guitar riffs in history. He told him about how Hendrix was deeply insecure about his singing voice, how he would sometimes ask Lemmy if a particular vocal melody sounded good enough, genuinely unsure of himself in a way that would have shocked the millions of fans who worshipped him as a god. These stories reminded Stevie that even the greatest musicians were human beings with doubts and shaking hands, and if Hendrix could wonder if he was good enough, then maybe it was okay for Stevie to have those same doubts and keep playing. The phone call came on a Tuesday, and it was the kind of phone call that changes the way you remember everything that came before it. Stevie Ray Vaughan had been performing at Alpine Valley Music Theater in East Troy, Wisconsin, sharing a bill with Eric Clapton and his good friend Robert Cray. By all accounts, Stevie had played one of the finest sets of his life that evening, burning through Texas Flood and Pride and Joy and Voodoo Child with a passion and precision that left the audience of 30,000 people on their feet. After the show, Stevie boarded a helicopter that was supposed to take him to Chicago, and somewhere in the fog and darkness over the Wisconsin hills, the helicopter crashed into a ski slope, killing Stevie and all 4 others on board instantly. He was 35 years old. He had been sober for nearly 4 years. He was, by every measure, playing the best music of his life. And just like that, he was gone. When Lemmy got the news, he was in the middle of a Motorhead recording session in Los Angeles. The details of his immediate reaction have been described differently by different people, but most accounts agree on one thing: Lemmy went completely silent. For a man famous for always having something to say, the silence was more disturbing than any outburst would have been. He put down his bass, walked out of the studio, and did not come back for 3 days. Nobody knows exactly where he went during those 72 hours, and Lemmy himself never talked about it publicly. What is known is that when he returned, he had a small photograph in his wallet, a candid shot of Stevie playing guitar on stage, head thrown back, eyes closed, lost in the music. Lemmy carried that photograph in his wallet for the next 25 years, through thousands of shows across dozens of countries, through health scares and lineup changes, and the slow physical decline that would eventually claim his own life on December 28, 2015. When they went through Lemmy's belongings after his death, the photograph was still there, worn and creased from years of being carried close to his body, the image faded but still unmistakable. In the years between Stevie's death and his own, Lemmy rarely spoke about that night in Atlanta. When interviewers asked about Stevie, he would deflect with a grunt or a change of subject. But there were rare, unguarded moments when the mask slipped. In a late-night conversation with a journalist in 2008, Lemmy said something the journalist almost left out because it seemed so unlike him. He said that the best thing he ever did in his life was not forming Motorhead, was not writing Ace of Spades, and was not surviving 50 years of substance abuse that should have killed him 10 times over. The best thing he ever did, he said, was reminding a kid from Texas that his hands already knew what his head had forgotten. It is a remarkable statement from a man who cultivated an image of invincibility and declared he had no regrets about anything. But perhaps that is exactly why those 6 words carried such weight when they were spoken in that rehabilitation center in Atlanta. They did not come from a therapist or a counselor or someone who had read a textbook about addiction recovery. They came from a man who understood, on the deepest possible level, what it meant to have music be the only thing standing between you and the void, because Lemmy had spent his entire life standing on that same edge, using the same medicine, just in a different key. Stevie Ray Vaughan's comeback after rehab lasted only 4 years before it was cut short by that helicopter crash in Wisconsin. But those 4 years produced some of the most extraordinary music ever recorded, music that continues to inspire guitarists around the world more than 3 decades later. And while no single moment can fully explain the miracle of that comeback, the people who were closest to Stevie during those years always come back to the same story, the same room, the same visitor, the same 6 words. Your hands remember what you forgot. Sometimes the most profound truths come from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the hardest man in rock and roll turns out to be the one with the gentlest understanding of what it means to almost lose the thing that makes you who you are.